The morning my ex-husband walked into my cafe with that smug smile on his face, I was elbow-deep in sourdough starter, my apron covered in flour, and my hair tied back in a messy bun that had seen better days. It was a Tuesday in late September and the autumn air in Portland, Oregon was just starting to turn crisp, the kind of weather that makes you crave warm coffee and fresh pastries. I'm Claire, I'm 41 years old and I'd spent the last 2 years rebuilding my life from the ground up after my marriage fell apart. If you've ever had someone you once loved look down on you, mock your dreams and make you feel small, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next is going to show you exactly why you should never let anyone dim your light. My cafe, Ember and Grain, sat on a quiet corner of Southeast Division Street, tucked between a vintage bookstore and a yoga studio. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a small brick building with big windows and a hand-painted sign that my friend's daughter had made for me. Inside it was cozy and warm with mismatched wooden tables I'd refinished myself, shelves lined with local pottery mugs, and string lights that gave everything a soft glow. The smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee filled the space every morning, and slowly, steadily, I'd been building a loyal customer base. Regulars who knew my name, who asked about my day, who made me feel like I was part of a community again. But that Tuesday morning when the bell above the door chimed and I looked up to see Derek standing there, everything felt different. Derek was my ex-husband, the man I'd been married to for 15 years before everything crumbled. He looked exactly the same as he had 2 years ago when we signed the divorce papers, tall and polished in his expensive suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, his watch probably worth more than my entire month's rent. And that smile, that condescending smile that I'd seen so many times during our marriage, was plastered across his face as he looked around my cafe like he was touring a museum of my failures. He wasn't alone. Standing next to him was Vanessa, his new wife, though I guess she wasn't that new anymore. They'd gotten married 6 months after our divorce was finalized, which told me everything I needed to know about when their relationship had actually started. Vanessa was younger than me by almost a decade, blonde and polished in that effortless way that comes from never having to worry about money. She was wearing designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, and she looked around my cafe with barely concealed amusement. Derek walked up to the counter where I was standing and I forced myself to smile, to act like seeing him didn't make my stomach twist into knots. He ordered a black coffee and Vanessa asked for some complicated latte with oat milk and sugar-free vanilla, the kind of order that takes 5 minutes to make. As I worked the espresso machine, I could hear Derek talking, his voice loud enough that I knew he wanted me to hear. He was telling Vanessa about how I'd always had these little dreams, these cute ideas about opening a bakery or a cafe, but he'd never thought I'd actually go through with it. He said it like it was charming, like I was a child playing pretend. When I brought their drinks to the counter, Derek looked at the price on the register and laughed. He actually laughed. He said something about how it was sweet that I was trying to make a living with my little hobby, but that real businesses required real capital and real business sense. Vanessa giggled and I felt my face flush hot with humiliation and anger. He pulled out his wallet, made a show of leaving a $20 bill for a $12 order, and told me to keep the change. Like I was a charity case. Like my cafe, my dream, my hard work was something to be pitied. They left and I stood there behind my counter shaking. Not just from anger, though there was plenty of that, but from something deeper. Him maybe. Or the old familiar feeling of not being enough, of being dismissed and diminished by someone who was supposed to have loved me. My assistant, Maya, a 23-year-old art student who worked mornings, came out from the back and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, but we both knew I was lying. The truth was, Derek had always made me feel this way. During our marriage, he'd been a successful corporate lawyer, climbing the ladder at one of Portland's biggest firms, making more money than we could spend. I'd been a stay-at-home wife, which had been a mutual decision at first, but over the years it had become something else. A trap maybe. A way for him to control everything, to make all the decisions, to remind me constantly that I didn't contribute financially, that I didn't understand the real world. When I'd mentioned wanting to take a baking class or maybe start a small catering business, he'd patted my hand and told me it was cute that I had hobbies. The divorce had been brutal. Derek had hired the best lawyers, and even though Oregon was a no-fault divorce state, he'd made sure I understood that I was leaving with far less than I deserved. I got a small settlement, enough to live on for a while if I was careful, but nothing close to half of what we'd built together. He kept the house, the beautiful Craftsman in the West Hills with views of Mount Hood. He kept most of our savings. I moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Southeast and tried to figure out who I was without him. Opening Ember and Grain had been terrifying. I'd used almost all of my settlement money to lease the space, buy equipment, and get through the first few months. I'd taken business classes at the community college, learned about permits and health codes and profit margins. I'd woken up at 4 in the morning every single day to bake bread and pastries, experimenting with recipes, failing and trying again. There were nights I'd cried myself to sleep, convinced I'd made a terrible mistake, that Derek had been right about me all along. But slowly things had started to work. My sourdough became popular, people started coming in specifically for my cinnamon rolls and my seasonal fruit tarts. I'd built relationships with local suppliers, buying organic flour from a mill in the Willamette Valley, getting eggs from a farm just outside the city, sourcing coffee beans from a roaster in Northeast Portland. My cafe wasn't making me rich, but it was surviving, and more than that, it was mine. Every loaf of bread, every cup of coffee, every smile from a satisfied customer felt like proof that I could do this, that I was more than what Derek had made me believe I was. But his visit shook me. For the rest of that day, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at my cafe, the dismissive tone in his voice. That night, lying in my small apartment, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if he was right. Maybe this was just a hobby. Maybe I was delusional to think I could build something real. The next morning I almost didn't open. I sat in my car outside the cafe at 4:30 in the morning, watching the empty street, and I thought about just driving away. But then I thought about my regulars, about Tom who came in every morning for a cappuccino and a blueberry muffin before his shift at the hospital, about Mrs. Chin who spent her afternoons reading in the corner with a pot of tea, about the book club that met every Thursday evening. They were counting on me. So I got out of the car, unlocked the door, and started baking. A week later, something unexpected happened. I was working on a new recipe, a honey lavender scone that I thought might be good for the fall menu, when Maya told me there was someone at the counter asking for me. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked out front, and standing there was a woman I didn't recognize. She was in her 50s, professionally dressed, with kind eyes and a warm smile. She introduced herself as Patricia Morales, and she said she was the event coordinator for the mayor's office. My first thought was that I'd done something wrong, that there was some permit issue or complaint. But Patricia quickly explained that she'd been coming to my cafe for the past month, always early in the morning before work, and she'd fallen in love with my pastries. She said the mayor was hosting a breakfast event in 2 weeks, a gathering of local business leaders and community organizers, and they wanted to feature local vendors. She asked if I'd be interested in catering the pastries and coffee. I almost said no. The self-doubt that Derek had planted was still there, whispering that I wasn't ready, that I'd mess it up, that I was out of my league. But something in Patricia's face, the genuine enthusiasm and confidence she had in me, made me pause. I asked her about the details, the number of people, the budget, the timeline. And as we talked, I realized I could do this. It would be a stretch, I'd have to bring in extra help and probably work around the clock for a few days, but I could do it. I said yes. Patricia smiled and shook my hand, and as she left, she mentioned that the event would be held at the mayor's residence, and that there would be significant media coverage. Local news, maybe even some regional press. It was a big deal, she said, and she was excited to have Ember and Grain be part of it. The next 2 weeks were a blur. I tested recipes obsessively, settling on a menu that showcased what I did best. My sourdough bread sliced thin for smoked salmon and cream cheese, my cinnamon rolls, lemon poppy seed muffins, those honey lavender scones, and a selection of seasonal fruit tarts. I hired 2 culinary students to help with prep, and Maya agreed to work extra hours. I barely slept, running on adrenaline and coffee and the terrifying, exhilarating feeling that this could change everything. The morning of the event, I loaded everything into my old Honda, which I'd borrowed a friend's van to supplement because there was no way everything would fit. I drove to the mayor's residence in the West Hills, a beautiful historic home with manicured gardens and a view of downtown Portland. Patricia met me at the service entrance and helped me set up in the kitchen. The event was being held in a large sunroom that overlooked the garden, and as I arranged my pastries on the elegant serving platters they provided, I felt a surge of pride. This was real. This was happening. The guests started arriving around 8. I stayed mostly in the kitchen making sure everything was replenished, brewing fresh coffee, but I could hear the murmur of conversation and laughter from the sunroom. Patricia came back several times to tell me how much people were loving the food, how the mayor himself had asked who made the cinnamon rolls. Around 9 she asked if I'd come out to meet some of the guests, and I reluctantly agreed, smoothing down my apron and hoping I didn't have flour in my hair. The sunroom was full of well-dressed people, the kind of crowd that would have intimidated me a year ago. But as I walked through, people stopped me to compliment the food, to ask about my cafe, to hand me business cards. The mayor, a friendly man in his 60s named Richard Chin, shook my hand and told me the pastries were the best he'd had in Portland. A woman from the Portland Business Journal asked if she could interview me for an article about local entrepreneurs. It was overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying all at once. And then through the crowd I saw him. Derek. He was standing near the windows with Vanessa, holding a plate with one of my cinnamon rolls on it, and the expression on his face was something I'd never seen before. Shock maybe. Or disbelief. He was staring at me like he couldn't quite process what he was seeing, like the world had tilted sideways and he couldn't figure out which way was up. I found out later that he'd been invited because his firm did legal work for the city, and he was there representing them. But in that moment, all I knew was that he'd seen me, really seen me, in a context he couldn't dismiss or diminish. I wasn't the struggling ex-wife with a cute little hobby. I was a business owner, a caterer for the mayor's office, someone people were lining up to talk to and compliment. I walked over to him, my heart pounding. Vanessa saw me first and her smile faltered. Derek turned and for a moment we just looked at each other. Then I smiled, the most genuine smile I'd felt in weeks, and I asked him how he was enjoying the pastries. He stammered something about not realizing I was the caterer, and I told him that yes, my little cafe had been chosen to provide food for this event. I said it casually like it was no big deal, but we both knew what it meant. Vanessa asked something about how I'd gotten such an important contract, and there was an edge to her voice, like she was implying I didn't deserve it. But before I could respond, Patricia appeared at my elbow. She put her hand on my shoulder and told Derek and Vanessa that the mayor's office had been searching for months for the right local vendor, and that my cafe had been the unanimous choice because the quality was unmatched. She said it warmly but firmly, and I saw Derek's face flush. He made some excuse about needing to talk to someone else, and he and Vanessa walked away. I watched them go and I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph exactly, though there was some of that. But more like a release, like I'd been carrying around his judgment and his dismissal for so long, and suddenly I could put it down. His opinion didn't matter anymore. His approval wasn't something I needed. I'd built something real, something valuable, and no amount of his condescension could take that away from me. The event was a massive success. The Portland Business Journal article came out 2 weeks later, featuring a photo of me in my cafe and a story about how I'd rebuilt my life after divorce. The article mentioned the mayor's event and included quotes from Patricia about the quality of my work. Within days, my cafe was busier than it had ever been. People came in with the article printed out, asking to try the famous cinnamon rolls. I got calls from other event planners, from corporate offices wanting to set up regular catering orders, from a local grocery chain asking if I'd be interested in supplying them with bread. I had to hire more staff. Maya became my assistant manager and I brought on 2 more bakers and another barista. We started opening an hour earlier to keep up with demand, and I began looking into a larger space, maybe something with a full kitchen that could handle more catering orders. The cafe that Derek had mocked, that he'd called a hobby, was becoming a real business, the kind that required business plans and growth strategies and all the things he'd said I didn't understand. About a month after the mayor's event, Derek called me. It was late on a Thursday evening and I was at the cafe doing inventory. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. His voice on the phone was different than I'd ever heard it, uncertain and almost humble. He said he'd seen the article, that he'd heard my cafe was doing well, and he wanted to congratulate me. There was a long pause and then he said he was sorry. Sorry for how he'd treated me during our marriage, sorry for dismissing my dreams, sorry for that day he'd come into my cafe and mocked what I was building. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell him that his apology was too little too late, that he didn't get to feel better about himself by unburdening his guilt onto me. But another part of me, the part that had spent 2 years learning to let go of anger and resentment, just felt tired. I told him I appreciated the apology, and that I hoped he was happy with Vanessa. And then I told him I had to go, that I had a business to run. When I hung up, I realized I meant it. I wasn't being petty or sarcastic. I genuinely had work to do, a life to live, dreams to chase. The holidays that year were different than any I'd experienced before. Instead of the lonely, quiet Thanksgiving and Christmas I'd had the previous year, I was busy with catering orders. I made pies for Thanksgiving, dozens of them, and holiday cookie boxes for Christmas. The cafe was decorated with lights and garland, and we hosted a holiday open house where regulars brought their families and friends. I felt connected to my community in a way I never had during my marriage, when my world had revolved around Derek's career and his social circle. In January, I signed a lease on a larger space, a former restaurant with a full commercial kitchen and room for more seating. The move was scheduled for March, and I spent the winter planning and preparing, working with contractors and designers to create something even better than what I'd started with. Maya was going to manage the original location and I'd oversee both, with the new space focusing more on catering and wholesale while still serving as a cafe. One afternoon in February, I was at the new space meeting with the contractor when my phone rang. It was Patricia from the mayor's office. She told me that the mayor had been so impressed with my work that he wanted to feature me in a new initiative promoting women-owned small businesses in Portland. There would be a video profile, some social media promotion, and I'd be invited to speak on a panel at a business conference in the spring. I said yes without hesitation. The video crew came to my cafe on a rainy morning in late February. They filmed me baking, talking to customers, working with my staff. They interviewed me about my journey, about the divorce and the struggle and the slow, steady building of something new. When they asked me what I'd learned, I thought about Derek's face at the mayor's event, about that moment when his smile had vanished and he'd realized I was more than he'd ever given me credit for. But that wasn't really the lesson, was it? The lesson wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about proving myself right. I told the interviewer that I'd learned that your worth isn't determined by someone else's opinion of you, that dreams don't have expiration dates, and that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the beginning of your best life. I said that losing my marriage had felt like losing everything, but it had actually freed me to become who I was always meant to be. The interviewer's eyes got a little misty and she told me that was beautiful. The video went live in March, just as I was opening the new location. It got shared thousands of times on social media, and suddenly I was getting messages from women all over the country, telling me their stories, thanking me for inspiring them. Some were going through divorces. Some were stuck in marriages where they felt small and dismissed. Some were just afraid to chase their dreams because someone had told them they couldn't. I tried to respond to as many as I could, and each message reminded me why all of this mattered, why the struggle had been worth it. The grand opening of the second location was on a sunny Saturday in late March. The line stretched down the block and we ran out of cinnamon rolls by 10 in the morning. The mayor came and cut a ribbon, and Patricia was there with a huge smile, telling everyone that she'd known from the first bite that I was going to be a success. My parents drove up from Eugene, proud and supportive in a way they hadn't always been during my marriage. Friends I'd lost touch with during the divorce years came back into my life, celebrating with me. And Derek? I heard through mutual acquaintances that he and Vanessa had separated. Apparently, the same patterns that had destroyed our marriage were playing out in his new one. I didn't feel happy about it, but I didn't feel sad either. I just felt distant from it all, like it was a story about people I used to know but didn't anymore. His life wasn't my concern. My life was full enough without him in it. By summer, Ember and Grain had become a Portland institution. We were featured in food magazines, included in lists of the best bakeries in the Pacific Northwest, and I'd been approached about writing a cookbook. The business was thriving, but more than that, I was thriving. I'd started dating again, nothing serious yet, but it felt good to be open to the possibility. I joined a hiking group and spent my rare days off exploring the Columbia River Gorge and the Oregon coast. I'd reconnected with parts of myself that had been dormant for years. One evening in July, I was closing up the original cafe location, the small brick building on Southeast Division where it had all started. Maya had already left and I was alone, wiping down tables and turning off lights. I paused by the window and looked out at the street, at the people walking by, at the warm summer evening light. I thought about that Tuesday morning when Derek had walked in with his smug smile, when he'd made me feel small and foolish for daring to dream. If I could go back and tell that version of myself what was coming, I'm not sure she would have believed me. The success, the recognition, the sense of purpose and pride. But more than any of that, the peace. The deep, abiding peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're meant to do. Derek's mockery had stung, but it had also been a gift in a strange way. It had shown me that I didn't need his approval, that I never had. The only person I needed to prove anything to was myself. I locked the door and walked to my car, and as I drove home through the warm Portland evening, I felt grateful. Not for the pain or the struggle, but for what they taught me. That resilience is built in the breaking and the rebuilding. That success is sweeter when you've earned it yourself. And that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living well, building something beautiful, and refusing to let anyone else's limitations become your own. I'm Claire, I'm 42 now, and I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. If you stayed with me through this whole journey, thank you. It means something to share these stories, to know that maybe someone out there needed to hear that it's possible to start over, to build something from nothing, to prove the doubters wrong not by confronting them but by succeeding anyway. If this story touched you, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to the channel. There are more stories here about people who refused to give up, who found strength they didn't know they had, and I think you'll want to hear them. Drop a comment saying, "I chose myself too," if you made it to the end. It helps me know you're out there, that we're building this community together. And if you could hit that like button, it helps these stories reach more people who might need them, who might be sitting in their own small cafe or their own small dream, wondering if they're enough. You are. You always were. There's another story waiting for you, another journey of transformation and triumph. Click on the next video, and I'll meet you there with another reminder that your story isn't over. It's just beginning.